Hello, welcome to the next in our Tank Talk webinar series hosted by Tank Storage Magazine. Today we're talking about COVID-19 and whether it has accelerated the energy transition across Asia. We have two excellent speakers with us today. We have Yuansheng Yu, who is the Senior Analyst at Lux Research, and we have Tom Smake, who is Business Development Manager for LNG Asia at Vopak. Before we start, I'd just like to direct you to the right-hand side of your screen. There's several polls there if you'd like to participate in those. And there's also the chat function, so feel free to ask questions and we'll do a Q&A session at the end. So I shall hand over to Yuansheng now. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. And thank you to Tank Storage Magazine for hosting this webinar, giving Lux the privilege to share the virtual stage with an organization like Vopak. So let's just get right to the chase. No doubt this year has been very different for all of us within the energy industry or any industry. Pretty much all of the world came to a standstill earlier this year. And now as we sort of enter a second, third, or even fourth wave of COVID, depending on what country you're in, the potential of more lockdowns really has us questioning what the energy industry could potentially look like in the near term and looking forward. There's been some initial shocks and significant impacts on all aspects of the sector, but more importantly, one of the sort of silver linings of it all is the potential of a post-COVID rebuild of the entire energy sector with a great focus on green energy or clean energies. So today we'll look at some of those initial shocks, what it means in the grand scheme of the energy transition, and lastly, what are some of the mid to long-term outlooks moving forward. Compulsory slide from marketing at Lux, but for those of you not familiar with Lux, we are a strategic advisory firm assisting our clients in navigating the energy transition, identifying opportunities and new technologies and business models innovations to drive the future of the energy business. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or check out our website. There you go. So this year has been an unprecedented time, from personal to business to financial. But when it comes to the energy sector, four major initial shocks were eye-opening events for the entire industry, largely within the oil and gas, electricity, emissions, and mobility. Now, while the sudden effects may be a flash in the pan as the world eventually returns to normalcy, as the vaccine begins to get rolled out, this pandemic will undoubtedly, in our minds, catalyze the energy transition moving forward, as stakeholders got a snapshot into the future of the dynamics of their industry. So in the next following slides, we'll kind of highlight some data points and really just talk about what happened and what we think this means in the grand scheme of energy transition. So first and foremost, I think March and April was probably the wildest ride for the oil and gas industry in quite a long time. There was a significant drop in global oil demand, and the overall picture really still remains unclear. There's a lot of different forecasts on how fast or how slow oil demand will recover post-COVID. Overall, I think the general estimates is there will be a 20% drop in oil demand this year. And the only other time there's actually a global demand decrease was in 1980 during the second oil crisis. Even then, it was just a mild 5% compared to the 20% of this year. Now, sudden drops coupled with uncurved supply led to a crash in oil prices, which have largely started to stabilize now. And we even witnessed the history's first negative oil price future. Now, this, of course, was largely an anomaly, but it did expose the oil industry for its lack of flexibility in its product mix and production capacity to gracefully handle a demand decrease. More importantly, though, is that this was actually a stress test in 2020 for what we believe, or many believe, will occur to the oil industry in the coming decades in terms of demand. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that there will be no more oil demand in the future. That's just untrue. Oil will still be around, but there will eventually be a peak, and the industry must start preparing now to adapt to the reduction and sort of reduce its vulnerabilities to its core business, especially as the share of oil demand overall decreases and declines in the energy mix. Moving from oil and gas to electricity, global electricity consumption was very similar, falling more than 15% during the first half of the year. And in countries such as the data shown here on India, witnessed a 40% drop during their nationwide lockdown. Now, initially, this was largely due to shutdowns of manufacturing facilities, industrial plants, but even as residential electricity consumption began to increase as people stayed home, there was really no match to offset the difference. Now, the biggest victim this year within electricity space was coal-fired power plants. Coal, which was well on its way down the path of demise in most parts of the world, felt the brunt of this downturn. China reported a 4-year low in coal consumption. India saw a 30% decline in coal-fired electricity, and the US coal industry likely saw the end of its time as renewable electricity surpassed it in the US electricity mix for the first time in history. Now, just like the oil and gas industry, those playing key roles in sort of the electricity value chain also saw a snapshot into its future. Not only was there lower coal demand, but also utilities and operators started to have to deal with grid systems that were suddenly running on very high percentages of solar and wind energy. Again, a preview of what is expected 10 years from now. Now, if there's a bright spot, if you can say there is a bright spot within all of this, that has to be emissions. As the first lockdowns went underway, data regarding emissions were sort of a silver lining in all of this mess. China saw its emissions drop 25% in Q1 compared to 2019. India's emissions decreased for the first time in history. Now, the magnitude of reduction varies country by country, but globally, we will see approximately a 0.26 metric ton per capita decrease compared to 2019. And as you see on the figure on the right, that's the second largest drop per capita since World War II. And it's no surprise that it's almost identical to the last global pandemic, the Spanish flu. Now, in absolute terms, it is obviously the largest drop overall, with about a 7% overall reduction. Now, beyond CO2 emissions, we also witness air quality improvements, especially in cities notorious for poor air quality. Tom and I were just talking prior to this webinar beginning, Southeast Asia, Jakarta, Manila, Bangkok, cities that we used to frequent for business travel, they're also notorious for having some of the worst air quality around the world. But this year, a lot of the citizens start to see blue skies for the first time. Now, while this may be temporary, it also really started a dialogue with many policymakers and regulators in these cities on renewing an emphasis on improving air quality as part of post-COVID plans. And last but not least, which is probably the most profound and most effective aspect of modern life today, is mobility. The movement of people significantly reduced this year. Of course, with international travel restrictions, the aviation sector was one of the hardest hit, seeing a 70% decrease in flights globally. But if you see sort of the Google data on mobility on the right, other forms of transportation were impacted as well, anywhere between 40 to 80% in reduction of movement, according to Google's tracking. And while aviation, we believe, will likely return to normalcy in the coming 3 to 5 years, other forms of mobility may not witness the same type of rebound as new habits, new routines are developed as it relates to working from home and even virtual conferences such as this. So the long-term outlook for mobility is the most difficult to assess. The longer this pandemic draws out, the more embedded new forms of services, commerce, and work will emerge and potentially become a new standard. These new trends and these new standards will actually have a substantial impact on mobility trends and mobility energy demand moving forward. And we're really keeping our eyes on what that might look like going forward. So to summarize here, we looked at these trends and then assessed them in terms of impact from now until 2030 and beyond. While you can all read this table and I believe get a copy after the event, I'll just highlight 3 that I believe will be key. The first one is in oil and gas. I think in the midterm, we do expect the decommissioning of a lot of capital intensive assets in the oil and gas industry, especially those that may find it difficult to be profitable under sustained low oil prices. However, we also see an alternative strategy being deployed, and that's we also see an alternative strategy being deployed, which is rather than decommissioning or being underutilized, it's to actually convert or retrofit some of these assets to produce low carbon fuels. One of the big examples this year was Phillips 66 and their Rodeo refinery, which will become the world's largest renewable diesel facility in the world once it comes online. And we expect several more oil and gas companies to make similar strategic decisions especially as liquid fuels will still be key in various forms of transport, such as shipping and aviation and heavy duty transport. Now, looking at the electricity market, in the near term, I think the electricity industry will see an uptick in digitalization and automation. I think that's a given for a lot of industries, a lot of remote work, looking at ability to digitize some of the operations and maintenance tasks. But the true impact of the energy industry will come during the midterm for electricity. With so many countries and companies struggling with the drastic change in the mix of electricity generation earlier this year, more renewables, less baseload, we actually expect an acceleration of investment, not only in more resilient power generation projects, but also in energy storage to complement them. And just to highlight something that Tom will talk about is COVID has maybe also been a catalyst for natural gas and LNG, especially in the Asia region. Tom will obviously dive into the details of this, but Asia has long been considered sort of the last stance for coal and thermal power generation. But coal being exposed to sort of the uneconomical times this year, and even with countries like India, Vietnam, and Philippines all placing a hold on coal projects, we can see a potential boost in LNG and natural gas demand moving forward, much faster than previously anticipated. And the last area is sort of emissions. Sadly, emissions are likely going to return to the previous trajectory in the near term. At the end of the day, we are human beings and we always revert to our bad habits. But we even might expect to see a huge surge in emissions sort of in the next couple of years due to pent-up consumer demand. But the long-term prospects of emission reduction are promising. And the real reason behind that is a lot of the post-COVID recovery plans have a strong emphasis on decarbonization. We can potentially see global emissions shifting downwards if a lot of these plans and targets become reality. Now, with several major economies announcing net zero ambitions this year, such as China, South Korea, Japan, the combined efforts of these large countries in Asia will likely be very key and instrumental in reducing emissions in the long term, 2050 and beyond. Now, in closing, to close here today, despite how this year has gone, I think we all must see the positive side of COVID, especially as it comes to the energy transition. The initial shocks, as I mentioned and highlighted in the presentation, were a glimpse into what the energy transition has projected for several years. It is a reality many countries and companies are already working towards. So while COVID was a black swan event, for the energy industry, not so much. It was a white swan event. We saw this coming. It just came probably 10, 15 years faster than we wanted it to. But this was a good stress test. The temporary changes served as a test, providing a preview of some of the more permanent challenges and changes the industry will likely face in the coming decades. And it's really a good time for organizations to learn from this year and make themselves more resilient as the energy transition continues to evolve. At the same time, countries currently planning post-COVID recovery must also capitalize on the opportunity to improve resiliency, provide greater agility, more importantly, insulating themselves from the macroeconomic impacts of the volatile conventional energy sector that we have today. And I think the reason why, if there's only one reason why we at Lux believe the energy transition will be catalyzed due to COVID, it's because there's a potential of trillions of dollars that may be directed towards low and zero carbon energy infrastructure moving forward. This has been key. This has always been the concern of the energy transition is how will we see this investment be allocated? Who will be making these investments? But we're starting to see the early signs now from a lot of countries that they will be earmarking very large checks towards the energy transition. And for organizations out there who are active in the energy space or even adjacent to it, it's really key right now to align your strategies will likely be a very critical moment in history for the energy sector. And that's COVID-19 and the post-COVID recovery. Thank you all for your time. And I believe we'll save questions for the end of the session after Tom has his chance to present.
Thank you, Yang Sheng. Really interesting presentation. Yeah, that's right. We will save questions for the Q&A at the end. So if you have any, do feel free to use the chat box on the right-hand side. Next, I will hand over, just load up the presentation. I will hand over to Tom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Margaret, for giving me the opportunity to speak during this virtual tank talk sessions, and also thanks for the kind introduction, Yang Chen, to discuss LNG in greater detail. As mentioned by Margaret, my name is Tom Smenk. I'm based here in Singapore, responsible for Vopak's LNG business development across the region here in Asia Pacific. For the next 20 minutes, I would like to elaborate on the LNG market developments across Asia Pacific and the LNG terminal developments in specific. The usual forward-looking statement, I wouldn't bother you on this topic. Before going into the market developments and the LNG market developments across Asia, let me start first with a very brief introduction to Vopak for those that are not familiar to the company. Vopak is world's largest independent tank terminal operator, storing vital products with care for its customers. A company, as you can see on this slide, with a rich history, currently its headquarters in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. One of Vopak's predecessors started more than 400 years ago, to store tea, coffee, and other herbs from the Far East back in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. And more than 150 years ago, Vopak was the first company to store oil in Europe, being imported from the United States. Slowly afterwards, Vopak expanded its network globally and added other products like chemicals and gases throughout the last century. The newest kid on the block, as you can see on this slide, is LNG, which we only started in the beginning of this century. And actually last year, also alluded by my previous speaker, we made the first investment in hydrogen, which we also see as a clear new future to invest in as an infrastructure provider. As of today, Vopak has in total 66 terminals across the globe in 23 countries. And with respect to LNG, currently we have 4 LNG terminals in operation. These 4 LNG terminals are located in, number 1, the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, Mexico, in Altamira, on the Atlantic side, Colombia, and last but not least in Pakistan. The first 2 are onshore LNG terminals, and the other 2 are Evergy-based terminals, so floating-based terminals. In addition to the 4 terminals in operation, we have an active business development agenda with currently 5 projects being announced in the public media. That is in Europe, in Germany, in Asia, that is in mainland China, that is in Hong Kong, as well as Singapore. And last but not least, we are looking for an onshore LNG terminal in Pakistan. LNG or gas in general will play a vital role in the energy transition going forward here in Asia Pacific. This can be explained through 2 elements in the power sector, where most of the gas and LNG in particular is taking place. So number 1, gas power plants emit up to 50% less CO2 compared to coal and oil-fired power plants. Number 2, gas power generation is very flexible, with up to 60% shorter startup time compared to coal. Therefore, it is more complementary to renewables, as we all know that the sun does not always shine and the wind does not always blow. Looking at the LNG demand growth globally at this slide, as you can see, almost all the demand growth is expected to materialize here in Asia Pacific. In this part of the world, demand is expected to increase by around 50%. In Europe, as you can see in this slide, there is an expectation that demand will slightly decrease due to competition from gas pipeline supplies as well as the strong agenda for renewables. The other parts of the world, in particular Latin America, Middle East, Africa, are expected to see significant relatively growth, but in absolute terms, still limited. Within Asia Pacific, the majority of the demand growth will materialize in China and India, as reflected in this slide. Obviously, next to the existing mature markets being Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Other markets with significant growth are the largest countries here in Southeast Asia, such as Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore, as well as other South Asian countries, in particular Pakistan and Bangladesh. Zooming into the LNG terminal requirements, to realize this demand, two factors are important to take into consideration. Firstly, what the government wants. Secondly, what the market desires. If we look from a government perspective, and if you look at the policies they typically set in the energy market, and in particular related to gas and LNG, three elements that are stepping out. Firstly, gas needs to be affordable. Hence, it is very important to steer competition among suppliers and off-takers in the respective jurisdictions. Secondly, most governments will favor gas relatively to coal and oil in the power mix, at least, due to the environmental benefits. Last but not least, security supply is an important pillar in these policies. So in this respect, related to the infrastructure developments, for government it is very important and essential that LNG infrastructure will be safely operated with high reliability and security supply standards. In addition, to steer the competition on the gas-to-gas side, especially in deregulated markets, governments want to involve purely independent infra players that can offer infrastructure on a non-discriminatory open access basis. Looking at the market requirements, four factors are important to take into consideration. So number one, in line with the government wants, also the market itself strives for high reliability and safety standards. Secondly, a large part of the users of infrastructure, particularly international oil companies, prefer not to invest themselves, as they do not consider that the part of their core business. And at the same time, all the users of infrastructure will look at the lowest cost by, for instance, sharing the infrastructure. Thirdly, the market is looking for solutions that are fit for purpose, being either on the one hand floating solutions, on the other hand onshore solutions, or a combination, or in a modular type of setup. And lastly, market players across the value chain are looking for access to global networks, to global players, as well as global locations across the globe. Particularly zooming into this fit-for-purpose infrastructure solutions, often there is a strong debate in the industry between floating or FSUs, floating storage regasification units, on the one hand, and onshore solutions, onshore tank solutions on the other hand, and which one is the most competitive. From our perspective, there is no single answer to this, as it is very location and demand specific. At least, there are a couple of clear advantages when it comes to onshore tank terminal solutions. It provides the economies of scale after at least more than 4 million tons of throughput. And obviously, it is much easier to increase the storage capacity, to expand the terminal further, and to add services. Whereas for FSUs and other floating solutions, there are also clear advantages. On the one hand, shorter time to market, as it is easier to charter in an FSU compared to building an onshore tank, which typically requires 3 years. And in order to charter in an FSU can be done quite quickly, or at least a new build only requires maximum 2 years. And at the same time, by the fact that it is a floating solution, there is always the option to take it away if demand will disappear over time, or if demand will not materialize. So finally, in order to meet these needs from, on the one hand, the government, and at the same time what the market wants, we as a company, Vopak, believe we can address these elements. Firstly, Vopak is the market leader globally, and we do have high safety and reliability standards. Secondly, Vopak is an independent operator, and we do not trade molecules ourselves. That means that our focus is purely on the infra side, and we can provide these services and infrastructure at a non-discriminatory open access basis. Thirdly, we have more than 15 years of LNG experience and do offer both floating as well as onshore solutions. Lastly, we offer a global network of locations in 23 countries and do have a strong relationship with all the LNG players across the value chain. Thank you all. Looking forward to the questions.
Thank you, Tom. Really good, great presentation. We've had quite a few questions actually, so I'll get started. So Michael asks, do you see bio LNG stored today, and what do you expect of this in the future? I guess that one's for you, Tom.
Yeah, so I think it's a very good question. I think how we as a company see, I mean, going back to my first slide, I mean, the market will evolve slowly from the oil to the gas side and ultimately to the hydrogen and other renewables. Of course, in between, since hydrogen so far is not competitive and still requires a lot of subsidies from governments or very brave customers, at least to step over and to make the initial investments, and we are happy to take these investments. Obviously, we need to look at alternatives to make at least the current fossil fuels slightly more attractive from a carbon emission perspective. Obviously, there are a couple of options out there. On the one hand, you can compensate the carbon emission when it comes to LNG production and LNG supply, and provide so-called green LNG solutions. At the same time, and that is currently already happening in a couple of locations in, for instance, Europe, you can use biogas and liquefy it at a small scale manner in countries like, or regions like Europe or also here in Asia to make use of biogas instead. Whether this will be a major shift, that is to be seen, but probably we need to have, I mean, next to the push towards renewables, next to the push towards hydrogen, we also need to have solutions when it comes to compensation on carbon emission, so-called green LNG, or let's put it this way, to make biogas liquid and to use that in certain applications, for instance, the transportation sector.
Okay, and Tom, another question for you. Ragnar asks, you mentioned Vopak offers both onshore and FSU storage. How big is your FSU fleet? So
currently we have in our portfolio the current terminals which we have in operation, 2 are FSU based. In these terminals, we are not the owner of the FSU. We just charter in the FSU from one of the bigger shipping companies or FSU providers. So as we speak, we do not have an ownership on the FSUs, but we offer the full solution by chartering an FSU.
Okay, and Yuan Sheng, possibly one for you, this one. How important are governments in defining future energy landscapes?
I think governments hold the key. Our stance on the energy transition and how the future energy landscape will look is that the technologies are there or being developed, and they will inevitably grow and take a share of the market, government sets the pace in which it happens. So if government wants to play along or be supportive, then we can get there much faster. But even if governments do not support a sort of energy transition, the technologies and more dominant winning technologies will eventually win out and we'll still get there. So when it comes to the government, it's all about pace. Do we want to get this done in 10 years, 30 years, or 50 years? And that's really in their hands.
Okay. And Gordon asks, the post-COVID investment mindset will be a battle between fear of uncertainty and abundance of liquidity of currency. How will the hurdle return rate of renewables and oil and gas infrastructure investments get changed after COVID era and increased liquidity as a countermeasure?
Yeah, and so I saw that question come up in the Q&A session. So I would say I do agree that there is a lot of fear and uncertainty in a lot of these economic or fiscal plans for post-COVID recovery. However, I do disagree that the direction that these plans are going in terms of towards decarbonization are based on those fears. I would say that most governments have had these plans, have had these pledges to move their energy system in that direction. COVID just fortunately provided a catalyst or provided an excuse, so to say, to earmark that large of an amount of investment because it's tied into economic recovery. I think prior to COVID happening, it would be a tough argument to say for Germany to allocate 9 billion euros just for hydrogen. But I think because of COVID and the positioning of how that will work in terms of building out the economy and helping the economy recover, it becomes more palatable to the general population. So I do think that we're going to see continued investments in that direction, regardless of how things are after COVID.
Okay, thank you. Charles asks, how do you reconcile the increased demand of LNG to the decline of oil production? And does the world pure LNG production meet the projected increase in demand?
Do you want that, Tom, or should I take that one?
Up to you.
Okay. So I think that question came up due to the comment I made at the end about sort of increasing natural gas demand to sort of offset declining coal demand. At the end of the day, there has to be, it's not just going to be your conventional natural gas for LNG, as Tom alluded to for the previous question. There are other forms of methane. So bio-based methane from biogas, for example, is fully mature technology and growing interest. It's reasons why Shell and BP in the last couple of years have acquired renewable natural gas companies to add to their portfolios. And even thinking long-term, you can have synthetic methane. So you can have methane derived from CO2 electrolysis, which is an area that is being investigated now as well with some of the key companies in the oil and gas space. So I think in terms of sort of reconciling between oil production and LNG production, you have to also open up sort of the options of how you can get to that LNG. It might not just come from the conventional form. There are other ways of getting that supply.
Okay, thank you. Another one for you, Yuan Sheng. So the question is, do you think divergent government policies around the globe will prove to be an obstacle when it comes to the energy transition? I guess this is a follow-on from the earlier question about the importance of government policies.
I'd say yes and no. I think that's always been the rhetoric around decarbonization is, for example, I use the term loosely, but poorer, smaller countries say, well, we shouldn't be responsible for what you all have done, you larger, richer countries over the last couple centuries. However, I think that with some of the net zero pledges that have been made over the last 9 months with China, South Korea, Japan, and 2-3 years ago, the EU have already been pledged that. That's enough to move the needle. So even if the smaller players don't want to have such an aggressive decarbonization roadmap, if these larger players build out a energy supply chain or infrastructure for their own decarbonization, the smaller countries inevitably will get taken along for the ride. And I mean that by, for example, If China is able to reduce and become net zero by 2060, they will single-handedly reduce 30% of global emissions, theoretically. So that means they would be building out potentially all forms of zero and low carbon technologies and supply chains, and any export countries that they now export to will have to adapt to that. So there will be a trickle down effect for these governments who may not be as aggressive, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. One for you, Tom. Hydrogen may become a relevant commodity in the near future. We see first signs of this in Europe. Does Vopak expect hydrogen to become a commodity in Asia? And if so, where? For example, Japan, Korea, Australia, China, will they be the first movers? And does Vopak already work with hydrogen?
Thank you. I think a very good question, a very valid question, and very relevant question here in the region. Definitely, it will become a community here in Asia Pacific. Probably it will take time. And indeed, you have a couple of early adapters, like Ragnar was referring to. Definitely, it will be Japan, Korea, China, and Singapore from a demand perspective. And I think from an export perspective, predominantly these countries that have an excellent position when it comes to renewables, in terms of sun and wind available. So these are the obvious countries like Australia, but obviously also the Middle East is quite an active area or region where there are a lot of projects currently under development from an export perspective. So we see definitely from an export perspective, Saudi Arabia and a couple of other countries in the Middle East playing a very dominant role on that respect. At the same time, in the northern part of Australia, from an export perspective, we as a company, we love to play a role and to facilitate these new value chains. Having said this, it will probably take time in order to materialize. Currently, we have a couple of active projects ongoing. And next to our first investments back in Europe, we are now actively pursuing a couple of opportunities across the region. One is very active at the moment, is here in Singapore together with Keppel, being a local conglomerate that are also very active on the data center front. And there you see also, particularly on data centers and the customers using data centers, they are typically also, I would say, first movers in order to adapt this new community in the region. So we are actively working on a project, an integrated hydrogen to power solution here in Singapore to feed data centers, new data centers here in Singapore. So definitely something that we are actively pursuing in a couple of jurisdictions here in Asia, but it will take time.
Yeah.
Margaret, I just want to add, very exciting to hear from Tom and that Vopak's involved in this, but I do want to emphasize the point that he made that the hydrogen sort of value chain is still in its infancy. And everyone's talking about a hydrogen economy, which would have to basically be a renewable proxy to the existing oil and gas supply chain and energy trade. And that took 100 years to build, and we're all looking at 20 years to build something for hydrogen. And it's still fragmented. All the examples Tom brought up were showed exactly that. The Saudi Arabia, the Middle East projects are shipping green ammonia. The Australia projects are liquid organic hydrogen carriers. And then the recent project that was announced during Singapore National Energy Week from Australia to Singapore, they decided to not go with the energy carrier and decided to just build a very long underwater cable. So, at that point, hydrogen's not even involved because you're just moving electrons at that point. So I think there's a lot of interesting things happening, and that's definitely an area that we all should in this industry keep an eye on over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think having said this, and also related to one of the earlier questions, also here the government is extremely important. These type of projects in the early stage won't happen without subsidies and support from the government.
Absolutely. I don't think there's a company on this earth right now that can afford to build out their own hydrogen projects without government support. Exactly.
Okay, yeah, interesting. And on that, Girish asks about electric vehicles and their government policies. Will they have an impact on the fossil fuel consumption and storage over the coming years? Possibly one for you, Tom.
Yeah, definitely it will have an impact, of course, in the entire energy mix, particularly on the oil side. Of course, LNG or gas is not that dominant in terms of being used in the transportation sector. So it will predominantly push out on the oil side. And obviously that will happen first in the more mature developed markets and regions, whereby you see definitely here in Asia, in more immature markets, still markets under development, still a strong push for the more traditional fuels. So the oil fuels, in order to adapt and to start and to grow the transportation sector.
Anything you wanted to add on that, Yuan Cheng?
No, I was gonna add, you're absolutely right around electric vehicles and their inevitable influx into our transportation fleet, and on top of not just them getting cheaper and more on par in terms of performance with your traditional internal combustion engines, but then you have policies like the UK looking to ban new car sales for petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030, and China announcing similar things as well for 2035. And then Singapore looking to eliminate all internal combustion engine vehicles by 2040 on the island. So, that is drastically going to change oil demand. But to Tom's point, it's not really going to impact gas demand. I think natural gas vehicles make up a extremely small proportion of vehicle fleets in the world. There's a select few countries where natural gas vehicles are greater than 10-15% of overall fleet, but those are very niche markets and won't be moving the needle in terms of impacting gas demand, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. And Jace asked specifically about LNG trucking, whether that's a short-term or long-term solution.
Yeah. I think it is a short-term and a long-term solution. Will be big, or will be as big as regasified LNG and just the pipeline connectivity? No, for sure not. Actually, there are two elements to it. Number one is LNG trucking in the transportation sector, particularly on the heavy trucks that is currently using diesel. Definitely there is room for LNG, but that market is not a huge market. Obviously, where we see interest of LNG trucking is more to serve off-grid customers that are not connected to the main grid, to the main pipeline grid, in countries like in China, but also like in India, and obviously back in the States and back in Europe. That is quite an important market, particular to replace diesel, where you see off-grid customers using diesel in their small-scale power generation, which is number one, more expensive compared to LNG, even in a trucking basis. And at the same time, of course, obviously gas is, from an environmental perspective, much more friendly compared to diesel. So definitely in I would say remote areas of grid customers, there is definitely a huge potential in the short run as well as in the long term. And obviously there is a small niche market on heavy trucking to use LNG as a fuel in these trucks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I had a question. It's probably for Yuan Cheng, just about vaccinations, really. Do you think the prospect of vaccinations is going to have an impact on the energy recovery?
When vaccine news came out, oil prices went up 2%. So from a market speculation standpoint, I think it does mean there will be a recovery. I'm not someone in the medical space, so I can't comment on the efficacy and uptake of the vaccines. But vaccine or not, eventually in the next year or two, people around the world will start moving again at the rate they were prior to COVID. And with that, there will be a increase in energy demand, especially in aviation and likely in road transportation as well. So I do think that initially, when the vaccine does come out, there might be sort of what a lot are talking about, that pent-up consumer demand, where you might see more people going out than you normally would see. And I think that's going to cause sort of that initial surge, and then we'll kind of return back to that trajectory that we've always expected.
Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, following on from that, I guess, what about the aviation industry? How do you see that recovering post-COVID?
So most industry studies have shown that the aviation industry will likely take anywhere from 3 to 5 years before returning back to how they were operating in terms of capacity. And in addition to that, quite a few sort of low-cost carriers went bankrupt or have sort of liquidated. But you know, with sort of that 5-year timeline, that's sort of where we believe the sort of U-shaped recovery will occur for the aviation industry, because it's quite a sharp decline. I mentioned to you, I flew from Singapore to Zurich just a week ago. There were 6 people on my plane. That's not sustainable from a business perspective, I'm sure. So, you know, inevitably there will be a U-shaped recovery, but many believe that's going to be at least 3 to 5 years.
Okay, thank you. Ping asks this question for Tom. He said, noted that storage companies are in a good position in 2020 due to contango. Does this change the investment or expansion strategy for Vopak compared to your pre-COVID plans? And if so, what has changed?
Thanks for that question. I think it will not change the strategy of our company. I think the contango and the impact on our business is largely related to our oil activities. So it is not related to our LNG or gas business. Obviously, I think in general, our company and our target of our company is more to focus on the structural flows from point A to point B, whether it is gas related, whether it is chemical related, or whether it is oil related. I think the phenomenon on contango and backwardation, it's a very small market component and part of the strategy, where typically in a contango situation, indeed there is a strong demand for storage, and obviously that is the cream on the pudding we are looking for in terms of our business, in terms of our strategy. But there are also times when the market is in backwardation where we do not have that cream on the pudding in our strategy, in our business. So hence it is not a clear pillar of our strategy. We like to focus as an infrastructure company just at the structural flows from point A to point B, and of course where possible to try to optimize our positions and to make advantage of the contango play in the market. But it is only related to the oil business. Since the LNG activities, I mean, the liquidity, number one, the liquidity in the market is not as mature as in the oil market, and at the same time, the contractual situation on the LNG side, where typically our business model is that we have long-term take-or-pay contracts in place with our customers.
Yeah. Okay. We are nearing the end, so perhaps just 1 or 2 more questions. What is the outlook for LNG and marine fuel? Who wants to take that one?
The outlook in the marine fuel, I think, is a promising one. Will be the main driver of LNG? No, for sure not. That will remain the power sector as well as the industrial sector, but it will be part of the solution. So whether that will be 5%, whether it will be 10% of the total marine fuel, that is still a big question mark. But at least, I mean, in certain locations, like here in Singapore, like in Rotterdam, like in Fujairah, like in Hong Kong or in Panama. So I would say the prime bunker locations, definitely LNG will be part of the solution. Will be the majority of the marine fuels? Probably not.
Well, according to a lot of shipping decarbonization roadmaps, LNG has to take up the majority in order for us to smoothly transition to hydrogen. So we'll see. I agree with your point, Tom. I don't think it's going to see as much uptick as many expect or want it to have. I think liquid fuels are still probably going to be the primary form for shipping.
But it will be probably a combination. I mean, you also will see the introduction of green ammonia, for instance, so the more the hydrogen-related part. So that definitely will be a basket of several solutions, options, where ship owners will choose out of.
And I think that's the concept that many in the energy industry are struggling to grasp, is because they've been trained to see the space as one dominant carrier. It's either oil or natural gas. But the future is going to be, there's still going to be oil and natural gas, but there's not going to be a dominant hydrogen or electricity. It's going to be a mixture, like you said. And I think that such a diverse energy mix is the concept that many of us can't fathom at this point, because we've never seen anything like it. And I think that's what's exciting as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, so a lot to get our heads around. Okay, a couple more questions have come in. Stuart asks, are you seeing any other major initiatives speeding up, as is often the case in downturns, such as increased terminal automation or other initiatives to the tank storage sector? One for you, Tom, I think. Are you seeing any in Europe terminals?
I think over the past period, the past decades, of course, you will see already quite increased efforts in terms of automation and digitalization in general. I think also our company, and it was already pre-COVID, that our executive board emphasized on the one hand to push further on the digitalization and the automation itself, and on the other hand to make the switch towards the lighter end of the barrel, so towards LNG and ultimately towards hydrogen. Of course, I mean, the COVID situation might even accelerate the drive towards automation in that front.
Okay, and Amit asks, how do you see investments in downstream oil and gas, especially refineries, in the next decade in different regions?
I could take this one, Tom. I mean, the projects are already there. All the major billion-dollar refinery projects have all been announced in the last couple of years, have all been in Asia. India, ExxonMobil wants to expand its petrochemical complex in Singapore. And it makes sense because demand for downstream products are expected to grow substantially in the Asia region, Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia. And that's sort of, they're putting it where the demand is. And I'm not saying, I don't think that we're going to see refineries, too many refineries get shut down. Obviously, Shell has made announcements and sort of their reorg strategy shift that they will be closing some refineries, and you'll notice none of them are in Asia. They're mostly in the western part of the world. So I think that's going to be the large contrast. In terms of dollar amounts and what we expect to see, I do think that we'll see a lot more crude to chemical complexes in the future as well. So just a direct sort of play from oil and gas players to go from crude straight to higher portion of the barrel towards chemicals versus gasoline and diesel. And that's a strategic shift that Saudi Aramco, Reliance, and Exxon have all sort of been looking into because they believe that there will be a decrease in sort of your more traditional gasoline diesel products, and they want to make more chemical feedstocks that they can then convert into higher value products. But that's my position on that. I'm sure, Tom, you may have some different opinions as well.
No, I think I would resonate on that one. Of course, what you probably will see indeed, on the one hand, in the major offtake markets, like in China and like here in Southeast Asia and in India, you will definitely see large mega refinery complexes. And at the same time, like you said, in countries that have a strong advantage when it comes to the commodity itself, being on the oil and gas reserves, they will probably also speed up their investments on further going downstream, and to also invest further in these type of mega refineries that is back in the Middle East, that is back in the United States. So probably you will see a drive towards further consolidation and drive towards further economies of scale. On the one hand, in the major demand centers, and on the other hand, the major export centers.
Okay, thank you. And Charles asks, how do the forecasts change if CCUS becomes economically competitive?
That's your expertise.
The reality is two parts. One, if we plan on hitting net zero, meeting the Paris Climate Agreement, etc., any of these aggressive targets by 2050, carbon capture will have to be widely deployed for a lot of the primary point emission sources. Issue is it's not the Band-Aid that's going to fix all the problems because there's only so much space you can store CO2. So for example, the North Sea is ideal, and that's why Equinor and et cetera are working aggressively in developing carbon capture sequestration projects. However, if you look at Japan, South Korea, all the companies there, none of them are really looking into carbon capture sequestration because there is no geological sources for them to store their carbon. So most of the companies there are looking at carbon capture utilization. So that's the difficult part because carbon capture and sequestration is quite straightforward. It's widely done in the US. A lot of times the CO2 is sequestered or piped away to do enhanced oil recovery. So the capturing part and sort of the downstream processing of the CO2 to be used as is commercially done now. And with a supportive government policy, such as the US's 45Q tax credit, it actually can see traction. The issue though is there's only so much you can do with pure CO2. And that is why utilization or conversion is going to be key. But that is still a technical challenge. Much of the research is still in the very early stages. There are some companies that are demonstrating it, especially in Europe. Covestro makes CO2 polyols materials. Carbon Recycling International makes CO2-based methanol. However, they feed into very small sort of use cases. So if we are able to sort of change net zero, we do have to see carbon capture conversion become commercially viable. And we don't expect that to occur for at least another 20 to 30 years at this moment, unless there is a Nobel Prize worthy sort of breakthrough on the scientific side in the coming years.
Yeah. Also, I mean, again here, unless the government is stepping in and to set a scheme at least on the CO2 taxing, and it will be properly taxed. Not only, I mean, that is currently happening in Europe, but you hardly see it here in Asia at least. I mean, and if that is being implemented by the government, of course, you will see CCU and CCUS as a more dominant type of solution.
Yeah, exactly. And to the sort of carbon pricing, carbon tax point, that is definitely one factor. From our analysis, we need about $200 per metric ton to make some of these processes economically competitive. What really changes and actually moves the needle is cheaper renewable electricity. So if we can get renewable electricity down to 2-3 cents per kilowatt hour, then there's a conversation to be had, which we're getting close to. Obviously, a lot of the power purchasing agreements are getting to that point. So that's kind of the status quo of CCUS.
Okay, great. Brilliant. Well, that brings us to the end of today's webinar. So thank you very much, both of you. We've covered a really wide range of topics from electric vehicles, hydrogen, LNG, carbon capture. So thank you. I really appreciate your inputs. The webinar will be reviewed in the next edition of Tank Storage Magazine. So make sure you take a look at that, and the recording will be sent round afterwards. So Tom and Yuan Sheng, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.